Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, hello, Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and you might notice things look a little different this time around. This is Regis on the road. I'm currently in California, sunny California. Blizzard flew me out here for the Boomsday pre-release stream, but I didn't want to miss videos, so I'm recording this one from my laptop. So yes, I know the audio and visual quality are not up to the normal standards, but that said, who cares? We're still going to talk about the best legendary spells from the Boomsday Project. In fact, I'm going to rank all 9 of them from worst to best. So that said, let's just go ahead and jump into it. Up first here I have the Stormbringer for Shaman, and this one of course transforms all of the minions you have on board into legendary minions instead. And although that's a super fun effect and very cool, unfortunately I think there's some real consistency issues here. It's very unpredictable what the Stormbringer is going to do for you. You never really know if it's going to turn into something you need, so it's this risky sort of play at its base, but beyond that, it's often just not that good because random legendaries aren't the best minions. They're usually very synergy based, they're understated for their cost a lot of the time. So just as often as you hit that really good Tyrian Forge Ring, other times you're going to hit something with just stats that are unimpressive and some effect that you don't need. And what that means is you're going to take an advantageous position with lots of minions on board and perhaps throw it away and certainly not use it to win games. So unfortunately, I just don't see why you're wanting to play this. There are better options. Evolve as an archetype existed previously, and even Thrall Deaths here now probably still would do it better in standard format. So for me, the Stormbringer, although very fun and cool and funny, probably not going to be the most competitively viable card. And then up next here I have Xeric's Cloning Gallery for Priest at the number 8 spot. And Xerix is really a card that just suffers from being a little bit too expensive and not impacting the board enough necessarily the turn it's played. Beyond that, it also has consistency issues because keeping minions in your deck is not always easy, and if you're trying to pull off some specific combo or use the right sort of minions in your deck, often this is just going to whiff because you will have already drawn them, or perhaps by the time you even find this card, may be drawn through your deck completely. And at 9 mana, there's just not much room to do anything else on top of playing Xeric's Cloning Gallery, so it's really just summoning a bunch of tokens that potentially have some upsides with Death Rattles and such in the late game, but often that's, in my opinion, not going to be fast enough or impactful enough in turns that really, really matter in Hearthstone. So Xerix isn't unplayable by any means. A lot of these cards are going to be good moving forward, but still, as compared to the rest, falls a little short. So up next here we have Luna's Pocket Galaxy for Mage, and I know this is one where I'm going to differ from a lot of people. A ton of people have ranked this card pretty highly, giving it 4 or 5 stars, saying it's going to be meta-defining. I think it has some bigger challenges than that, so for me it only falls to the number 7 spot. And the reason for that is that despite the fact that this gives you a really big tempo advantage over the long term, reducing minions down to 1, I think there are 2 issues. Number 1 is that this comes post turn 7, so when tempo matters most, which is in the early game, it's going to be adding up over a longer time period, and often games are already starting to be settled by that point, so I don't know how much swing impact or recoverability this is going to offer. Now, there are some opportunities, of course, to like Flame Strike and play a giant minion all in one turn for 8 mana as opposed to not being able to do that at all. That's neat, don't get me wrong, but if you're running Flame Strikes, if you're running these big swing spells in your deck, that means your Luna's Pocket Galaxy is doing less because you have fewer minions. So you have to find this balance between spells and minions that seems difficult. And then perhaps the biggest problem of all, of course, is that you're spending 7 mana to do this, which is a really big tempo loss. So essentially, it takes a couple minions played to really gain that mana cost back. In Hearthstone, often it's difficult to just do a setup turn where you can't play anything at all. So Luna's Pocket Galaxy is not really going to be played on 7 a lot anyway, because you might be dead if you do it. You're going to be stuck blizzarding and flame striking and all that other stuff. So I think this card's going to fall in an awkward spot where it's just hard to put it in a deck and it's hard to play it once it's in that deck. And that's why, to me, it's only number 7 instead of much, much higher. So up next at the number 6 spot here, I have Flark's Boomzooka for Hunter, and with this one, I actually think this card will be very impactful when it's played, but the reason it's not a little higher on the list is because it's really only, in my mind, going to work in one version of Hunter, which is to say a version with Death Rattles, because summoning Death Rattle minions from your deck suiciding them into your opponent's stuff, clearing the board perhaps, and gaining some sort of advantage from those death rattles, that's a good play. But just using this as a board clear where you sacrifice your own minions, that's perhaps a little bit less compelling. That may not always be good. Now, that said, if you do run big enough stuff, Charge Devil Swords and King Crush and so on and so forth, you might think, hey, I get value trades, but you don't. They die at the end of the turn, so it has to be death rattles, right? That's the limitation here for Flark's Boomzooka, and that's why I do think this will be a good card in a Death Rattle Hunter deck. It'll be an important part of the puzzle as a late-game swing-style card, but not every hunter cares, so it's a little bit limited in its playability for the class as a whole, despite being a strong card in that one specific niche. And then up next here, I have Myra's Unstable Element at the number 5 spot. And when it comes to Myra's, it's so hard to figure out what this card's going to mean. It's either going to be the best card in the set or the worst card in the set, as far as I'm concerned when it comes to legendary spells. So perhaps it's fitting that I put it smack dab in the middle, because that's a bit of a cop-out. And the reason I say that is because clearly this effect is really divisive. It does something kind of bad, in that you don't love drawing through an entire deck all at once, but it does a couple things really well too. It draws you a lot of cards, and if you're playing a fast enough deck, if you're playing some sort of really aggro deck that's just looking for burn damage, Myra's could draw you 8 cards to give you that second wind and push for that lethal opportunity, because you don't care about fatigue anyway. And then beyond that, Myra's can also now set up some shenanigans with things like Lab Recruiter, Augmented Elic, Academic Espionage, to refill your deck with all kinds of crazy stuff after you've emptied it. So there are a couple of different ways for this thing to operate. The question just becomes, how reliable is that Augmented Elic, Lab Recruiter style of play? Does that work at all, or is that actually just really, really bad? And then is Myra's Unstable Element relevant enough in an aggro rogue deck, something like an odd rogue, to make the cut either? Because sometimes it would be a dead card in your hand. If you already have minions, if you already have resources, this is not something you want to see on turn 1. So even though it does give you that opportunity for a second wind, it also hurts your first push consistency a little bit sometimes. And it's just going to take a little figuring out to make sense of it, and whether or not it actually is going to make the cut in either style of play. And it's certainly got potential, but it could also just fail miserably, and that's exactly why it's in the number 5 spot. So up next here for the number 4 place, we have Floop's Glorious Gloop for Druid, a 1-mana spell. And this one's pretty intriguing because it has another one where it's a lot of opportunity, and I think the reason I ranked it so high is because not only a lot of opportunity, but I think it can be played in different kinds of Druid, believe it or not. I don't think this is only sort of a token Druid sort of card. It's this innervate tempo opportunity that might exist in faster Druids, but also slower, more control-oriented Druids as well. I think just when you've got the ability to swipe through minions or your opponent's stuff, this can be an innervate in a pinch in a lot of ways. It can do some sneaky things. So I think, you know, token, this is obvious because it can give you a lot of mana and help you swing hard on an early token trade board, playing some big scary thing, or ramping your mana even further, or drawing a ton of cards, whatever that might be. That exists as a way to play this. But even if you think about it as that free swipe or free starfall, or whatever it might be, Floop's Glorious Gloop still makes a little bit of sense to me there as well. I don't know how good it's going to be compared to other options. Of course, opportunity cost, always a factor to consider. But mana is great. Druid is a good class right now. They love using mana. So a lot of things seem to line up for this one for me to be a solid card. So now we're into the top 3, starting off with King Gore's Endless Army for Paladin. 7 mana, and this one resurrects 3 of the friendly mechs that you've had that died this game, but they also keep any magnetic upgrades. So specifically, this gives you a chance to reload a board with some really big, scary stuff. And that's always been a good thing in Hearthstone. When you can summon a lot of things all at once, that has historically been a great option. So, you know, N'Zoth, Gul'dan, those sorts of things work really, really well. And I think King Gore's is going to be that style of play, and in fact, it even comes a little bit cheaper here at the 7 mana instead of like the 10 mana spot for some of those big board reloads. So I can see this in a aggressive or mid-range Paladin deck that's all about mechs and applying a lot of pressure. Your opponent finally feels like they've stabilized and cleared your board and exhausted you of resources, but then you slam King Gore's Endless Army and you do it all over again, and they got 3 giant things they just don't know how to deal with. And of course, depending on how your magnetic buffs stack up and how you utilize those, it can become even more annoying than you'd ever imagine. And that's why Kangor's Endless Army looks good to me. Now, I will say this card is obviously pretty closely connected to the success of Mech Paladin. So if Mech Paladin doesn't make sense or doesn't work, Kangor's will be unplayed, right? It's not going to get played in a normal Paladin deck. So it's a bit risky to go all in and put this in the top 3 in that regard. But I'm not really trying to predict the meta so much as talk about the inherent quality of the cards at some level. So I do think this one just does something good. And even if it doesn't happen right away in this meta, maybe with a standard format rotation or a few other interesting mechs that kind of get trickled out in the next couple expansions, you never know with something like Kangor's, it could show up in a really, really big way. And of course, if Mech Paladin works, this card will be defining in the meta. And then up next here we have the Boom Ship, and I just talked about cards that summon lots of stuff and how good that is, and the Boom Ship's another example of that. But with the Boom Ship in particular, it's interesting because not only does it summon that stuff, it makes that stuff instantly activated via Rush. So you can get some big minions and you can instantly start trading and impacting the board with those minions. So it not only serves as this really big mana infusion of giant guys, but also potentially a board clear and a huge swing turn opportunity, and that's perfect. And I will admit that the Boom Ship does, of course, sacrifice some in-hand card advantage when you're drawing cards from your hand. That means 4 things you used to have in your hand are suddenly not in your hand anymore, and that seems risky. But keep in mind the fact that in the kind of deck that's going to want to run this, which in my mind is a control warrior, a real late-game warrior with lots of big minions, they've probably been barely hanging on throughout the course of the game, using defensive cards, taunts, removal spells, life gain, and they've been sitting on some big minions that they weren't able to play on turns 1 through 8 because they cost too much or they just didn't have time, whatever it might be. And then the Boom Ship's going to say, okay, look, you've hung on this long, now we're going to save you. We're going to summon all of that stuff at once. And, you know, even if it's just like some Direhorn hatchlings, right, that you didn't have time to play previously for whatever reason, and maybe a Ysera or a Lich King or a Grom or whatever it is, then boom, all that stuff gets brought into play. You've swung super hard, and you're going to move forward with a huge advantage after that point. And then also on top of that, I think another interesting aspect for the Boom Ship is actually the ability to use this as a burst damage combo. If you run a really control-oriented deck, you could put in things like Grom and charge Devil Swords, for instance, to do something like 24 damage with a single Boom Ship cast, along with a Whirlwind effect, I guess. But that's a possibility too, so, you know, this might be a finisher in some ways. I think it's going to be more about a rush value piece than a charge damage piece, but that opportunity exists, so keep an eye out for that as well. And all that said, because this card's fast, big, impactful, I think it's going to be really, really good for Warrior. Not to mention, I do think Warrior in a control environment has always been around at some level or another, and that's probably going to remain the case moving forward. So Boom Ship even looks good from a meta read standpoint to me as well. And then finally here I have my number 1 card. It's the Solarium for Warlock. And who would have thought a 1 mana card amongst all these giant heavy hitters would be my favorite card, favorite legendary spell from the Boomsday Project. In my mind, going to be the most played and most impactful. And that's because the Solarium just does something fantastic. For only 1 mana, you get to draw 3 cards. And that's completely insanely efficient. I mean, the most efficient card draw I think we've seen in the game thus far. And it's just so cheap that means, you know, it's not just about efficiency, it's also about cost totals, because you have a lot of mana left over to play those cards. And that will be important because Solarium is going to discard the cards at the end of your turn, but often you won't care because this is going to be played in faster, more aggressive Warlock decks like Zoo, which, by the way, has always been around in some form or another, dominating the ladder right now. Solarium would be perfect for that kind of deck because it does 2 things. It gives you a lot of minion resources potentially to just reload the board in a really fast fashion, playing lots more stuff, giving your opponent a ton of friction where they say, gosh, I just dealt with a bajillion minions. Here's a bajillion more. I can't answer it. Solarium, too much pressure. That divine favor kind of thing we've seen in the past for Paladin, Solarium operates in exactly the same way. Beyond that, it can also just draw you into burst damage in a pinch. So it can find those Soul Fires, it can find those Doom Guards, and it won't matter about the discard because you're just looking to kill your opponent. So if you're frantically looking for those final few points of damage, which, by the way, Warlock often is when playing Zoo, then this will help you achieve it much better than your hero power ever could. So it's basically the Warlock hero power on steroids, adding into a lot of the things Warlock already does well when reloading their hand and reloading the board. And it's just going to be perfect for Zoo. Now, I'll admit this may not be played in all kinds of Warlock decks because things like Control Warlock probably aren't going to be able to unload their hand or the cards that they drew, and they don't want to risk discarding a Gul'dan or something like that. So this will be limited to one archetype, but it's going to be so strong in that archetype, and that archetype has historically been one of the best in Hearthstone, that for me, everything lines up for the Solarium. This is absolutely going to be a defining card and probably the most powerful legendary spell in the Boomsday Project. And there you go, guys. That's my rankings for the legendary spells in the Boomsday Project. Again, I apologize for the production values. It was either bad camera, bad audio, or no video at all, so it's the best I could do. That said, I'm always curious to hear your guys' feedback on these cards. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? How crazy might have put Luna's Pocket Galaxy that far down the list? Share your thoughts. Don't just say I'm wrong or stupid. Tell me why. Share your take. Explain it. Nobody cares if you're wrong or right. We just all want to learn. So share your expertise. Share your knowledge. We're all going to be reading it and going to be excited to hear it. So go big or go home, as they say, to borrow a cliche. But that said, guys, thanks as always for watching. And until next time, game on.